What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, Danny? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual, except this is take 5 or 6. I don't even know. So I think we're gonna skip banter today, aren't we?
Yeah, we're going to skip banter because we've already delivered essentially an entire podcast with how many times we've had technical issues where we've just had to start over again. So we're going to get into it right away. Russian Revolution, right? That was nuts.
So crazy.
Wasn't it crazy? It was just like, who would have thought the Russian Revolution would have happened?
I don't know.
It was like, those guys were crazy. What's his name? Lenin? And something with a T, with an R. Trotsky. Lenin and Trotsky, and then the guy with the mustache guy with the family that the Disney cartoon was based off of. I think it was Disney, right? No, I think it was their rival. Okay, obviously it's going to be more in depth than that. And so far, we've stood the test of 2 minutes, or almost 2 minutes, where we haven't had an internet or technical issue. So I think this is going to continue. I have a good feeling about this.
Yep.
So, we're going to jump right into this. We've been doing a themed podcast a lot on the 20th century politics, really including the Russian Revolution, World War II, World War I.
Interwar period.
The interwar period. And really what the goal is, I don't really know what the goal is yet, but to find some type of knowledge. And we started talking about the Russian Revolution really, a while back, almost about a year ago, and wanted to follow up on that. And by no means do you need to listen to that episode to understand what's going on in this episode. However, it would be useful, so you can always listen to it afterwards, because we're going to be talking about different periods. But today, when we last spoke about the Russian Empire, what we were really speaking about were a lot of the systemic problems that the Russian Empire was having. In short, throughout the last half of the 19th century, Russia's economy was developing slowly compared to other European countries. It had a huge population of serfs who had been liberated in 1861. However, most of these people lived in complete poverty, even after serfdom. And these peasants were not really included in the naturalization process that was taking place in Russia. Really, Russian peasantry was a world upon itself. Now, at the same time, you have this radical intelligentsia class that was attempting to mobilize the peasant population into undertaking some sort of revolutionary change. And these movements were largely unsuccessful. But despite this, many of these groups were still violent. So in the late 1800s in Russia, it was a time of, limited anarchy. It wasn't like, after 1905, but it was a time of chaos, really, or maybe limited chaos. But this is really the period that Dostoevsky was writing about, in his books, The Possessed. It's a critique of these nihilist and populist movements. And these nihilist and populist movements at the time, essentially they're declaring war on the current regime, which is the Tsarist regime. And these were not the Bolsheviks. This is before them. But these groups lay the groundwork for, what Russian Marxism evolves into. And it really takes a different character than the rest of Europe. In one sense, these groups in this movement is a lot more resentful and bitter and even hateful. And it takes this kind of violent character. Now, pulling this back, and we spoke about this in prior, in 1879, there is this terror organization called the People's Will. And the People's Will, they assassinate Tsar Alexander II. And this event, it it's really the first major tipping point that foreshadows the revolution of 1917. Now, today I want to have another conversation about the fall of the Russian Empire. It's sort of this follow-up to the origins of the Russian Empire. I think we're going to concentrate more on, what becomes the Bolsheviks and what leads up to that. But we're also going to talk about the Russian state and things like that, and its character. So this can, like I said earlier, can absolutely be a standalone. And then maybe some shocks to the system that kind of put these, kind of move these events forward. But if I were to start an HBO show about the Russian Revolution, even though I think there's an HBO series or Netflix series on Trotsky, which I heard was pretty good.
Was there?
Yeah, I heard it was pretty good. And I haven't seen it yet. I should I should watch it.
I'm gonna Google that right now.
I think it's Russian. I think it's a Russian show. So who knows if there's like sanctions on it or something, or it's in Russian at the very least.
Yeah, there's a Trotsky miniseries from 2017. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's the one. Is it on Netflix?
It's on Netflix.
Yeah, so that's the one. I'm not sure if it was produced in Russia or what, or if there's some sanctions on it. There's still Russian video games that come out, so I don't know. Who knows? I'm not following the sanctions on media. But here's where I would start this story in my version. So it's May 5th, 1887. We're in a Russian courtroom and on trial as a 21-year-old kid. And, he has bad acne and he kind of has a baby face. But he has this kind of stern, serious face with like this classic, the Slavic stare. Mm-hmm. Now, this young man is on trial for attempted czaricide. And czaricide is obviously, the murder of a czar.
Right.
His crew called themselves the terrorist section of the People's Will. And this was the group, the People's Will was the group responsible for killing Tsar Alexander III's father, Alexander II, just 6 years earlier. And this group is all, basically noobs. They have no experience in terrorism. They have no experience making bombs. They're mostly like teenagers. They're wannabes. They don't have the skill set to pull off a successful insurgency. I'll take this from Helen Rappaport in the book Conspirator, Lenin in Exile. As conspirators, they were inept, to say the least. It was only their youth. The youngest was only 20, and their bungling incompetence that had saved St. Petersburg from yet another outrage. A spot check on two of the conspirators by suspicious police agents had uncovered the crude bomb filled with bullets dipped into stitching that was being carried by one of them inside a copy of Grinberg's Dictionary of Medical Terminology. So there was a plan to follow Alexander III as he went to church he was going to church to commemorate the anniversary of his father's death. And the plan was really just to go up and start chucking bombs at him. That was the plan. Just start, as he's walking out of the church, just start throwing bombs at him. And the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, they had already infiltrated this group and arrested all of them. So the young man who's on trial was the bomb maker and really the chief ideologue. And in this young man's possession, the police found a manifesto reading, "The spirit of the Russian land lives, and the truth is not extinguished in the hearts of her sons. On 1887, Tsar Alexander III was executed." So it's his basically it's like, it's equivalent to when, you get like, congratulations, Eagles Super Bowl winners. He was so excited that he thought that was going to be reality, and he, pre-wrote his manifesto.
Right.
with the assumption that they were successful in assassinating Alexander III.
The hubris on this guy.
The hubris. So this kid was a real radical. The Tsar, in all of his mercy, allowed this kid's mother to visit him. And, when his mom visits him, this young man tells her that, he was sorry for the suffering that he had caused her, but his first allegiance was always to the revolutionary movement. So in this show of extreme self-righteousness, this young man, he refuses to be represented by counsel, by a lawyer. And then he gets up and he says this to the court. Terror is the only form of defense by which a minority strong only in the spiritual strength and a consciousness of its righteousness can combat the physical power of the majority. Among the Russian people, there will always be found many people who are so devoted to their ideas and who feel so bitterly the unhappiness of their country that it will not be a sacrifice for them to offer their lives. My purpose was to aid in the liberation of the unhappy Russian people under a system which permits no freedom of expression and crushes every attempt to work for their welfare and enlightenment by illegal means. The only instrument that remains is terror. We cannot fight in this regime in open battle because it is too firmly entrenched in and commands the enormous powers of repression. Therefore, any individual sensitive to injustice must resort to terror. Terror is our answer to the violence of the state. It is the only way to force a despotic regime to grant political freedom to the people. There is no death more honorable than the death for the common good. End quote. Just so no one takes that out of context.
Whoa.
You never know.
Yeah, right. Henry said the only way to get anything done is through terrorism. This is interesting. That's a fascinating quote, dude, because especially because we're coming up on the God knows which anniversary of 9/11, and the word terror and terrorism is kind of fresh in everybody's mind, and it's fascinating to get a glimpse into how the folks who have these radical ideologies who like kind of psychologize them and figure out how it is that they come to the conclusion that this is a good idea. And this young man that you're talking about, he's basically just saying like, hey, this is literally the only thing that we can do. To quote again, terror is the only form of defense by which a minority strong only in its spiritual strength and the consciousness of its righteousness can combat the physical power of the majority. He's got a complex, man. He's got a bit of a screw loose, but I mean, kind of hard to argue with him though, in a certain sense.
So I think what this represents is really kind of the revolutionary spirit of many of the people who were involved in the later Marxist Bolshevik movements and the populist movements, because like him, he was executed. There was tremendous cost to this as well, not just in Russian Marxist, but I mean he wasn't even really a Marxist. He was just kind of a populist nihilist, but let's just say extremist or revolutionaries. There's usually a tremendous cost to it,
right?
Meaning that you're either going to be thrown in a dungeon or jail or sentenced to death or even assassinated. So, the other important point about this is that this man was named Alexander Ulyanov, and for those who are familiar with Vladimir Ulyanov, will know that this is his brother, Vladimir Lenin's brother. So, this was Vladimir Lenin's older brother, and the assassination of him played a significant role, at least according to biographers, on Lenin's life trajectory.
So that's interesting because I didn't actually know that Vladimir Lenin's real last name was Ulyanov. Are we going to talk about that, or do you know?
Yeah, Ulyanov. Lenin was a code name, basically. Ulyanov is his real name.
I didn't know that.
But yeah, that comes later. But the Ulyanov family, I'll get deeper into Lenin's personal life, But
Okay.
first, let's pull this back. In the 1870s and early 1880s, Russia was in a phase of what you can call intense political friction between the state and radical student movements, and more threatening radical student movements that would resort to terror. So, it was, the time of Dostoevsky. Just read not Fires in the Hearts of Men, but that's a quote from the book. But fires, the possessed or devils. There's the quote. The house isn't on fire. The house isn't on fire. The fire is in the minds of men. That's where that's what he's writing about, this period of time. But I'll quote from another historian, Victor Serge, in the book Year One of the Revolution. Between 1872 and 1882, there were 6 attempted assassinations, 3 of these successful against high officials, 4 against police chiefs, 4 against Alexander II, 9 executions of informers, and 24 cases of armed resistance to the police. 31 revolutionaries.
That's about as many assassination attempts as we've had attempts on trying to make this podcast, I think.
Yeah, for real. we've had 6 times. Well, at least the other times we didn't get this far into it. But
yeah, right. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just
no, that's
really
fine.
funny.
Alexander II is the father. He was assassinated. We spoke about his assassination at length in our last episode covering this. And it was really a bizarre plot. I would recommend it just for that, final 20 minutes where we discuss that. But it was like almost guaranteed that he was going to get killed by the amount of times that revolutionaries went after him.
Because he never stepped up his security.
He just never. They never stepped up their security. They were just like, all right, whatever.
Side note, continue with your quote.
But all right, so 31 revolutionaries were hanged or shot on April 14th, 1879. The student Solyunov fired 5 pistol shots at Alexander II. On December 1st, the same year, an explosion derailed the imperial train not far from Moscow. On February 17th, 1880, the dining room in the Winter Palace exploded seconds before the imperial family was due to enter it. On March 1st, 1881, Alexander II at last met his death in St. Petersburg, mangled by bombs. His 5 executionaries were all hanged. With these casualties, the party lost its finest leaders, some of them the finest revolutionary personalities known to history. At his accession, the new Tsar Alexander III proclaims the autocracy to be unshakable. The establishment of the Okhrana follows, a political police force armed with extensive powers and funds. A press law lays down preventive censorship for journals suspected by the authorities. They can even be suppressed. So I want to talk about this is really a fascinating group, and there's not that much literature on them. I was really looking hard for more stuff on this, and they're really maybe there's some more stuff in Russian, but the Okhrana, which are or Okhrana, I think it's pronounced more Okhrana. They're the Russia's secret police force. So Russia has this really long history of having a secret police.
Yeah.
And, there's secret police even before the Okhrana, but the Okhrana is like the first major, secret police force that in the Russian Empire, and really the most sophisticated police force in the world at the time. But
kind of laying down that groundwork for the KGB, huh?
Yeah, they have a lot in common. They have more in common with the FBI, really.
Okay, fair enough.
They're the Russian Empire's version of the FBI. So, the previous police was called the Third Section, which was created to combat some of the revolutions that took place in the early part of the 19th century. But these organizations only really had the ability to target individuals. By the 1880s, the regime is dealing with really professional revolutionary organizations. So, the old secret police, they were, catch that lone wolf type thing, or those couple of army officers that are gonna be mutineers. In a sense, this whole thing with Wagner boss is kind of a long line of mutinies, military mutinies.
Yeah.
Prigozhin. I don't know. Prigozhin slipped my mind for a second. I don't know why. But so amidst the renewals of assassinations, a new department of state police was created after really the assassination of Alexander II. And it began only as this small ad hoc group of special security sections of the police. However, it would soon turn into an extremely efficient secret police force. And it, basically what it did is it monitored and repressed political opponents, and revolutionaries. And they used secret police and secret informants. So a lot like how the FBI operates today. And, they would hire prisoners to be double agents. So they used agents, like agent provocateurs, to infiltrate and disrupt revolutionary organizations. They also created fake revolutionary groups as a whole to discredit, the genuine revolutionary movements. And, they did things like they would use torture and, they would exile people. They even had like these really large, kind of foreign agencies. So they had their foreign bureaus in like Paris, for example, that would, go after Russian populists who were in exile or who were, trying to form groups, kind of like these expat groups abroad. Mm-hmm. So they had offices all over the world, or really all over Europe. But I think most significantly, they were in Paris. And here's a really good book on like the rise of revolutionary movements throughout Europe is by James Billington, and it's called Fire in the Minds of Men. Right from the Dostoevsky quote. I'll quote from him: "The continued sparring between the police and revolutionaries took place in a twilight world of tacit understandings, personal alliances, and even mutual admiration. Close combat sometimes led to secret embrace. Names that were introduced on the right later reappeared in the vocabulary of the left. The extraordinary measures of the late Tsar's police prepared the way for the extraordinary commission of the early Soviet era." They had something called the Black Cabinet, which basically held files of all the revolutionaries in Europe. And a typical file entry on a revolutionary recorded basically all of that person's human relationships on radial lines leading out to different circles. So, there was red for terrorist links, green for political friends, yellow for relatives, and brown for people known to deal with these revolutionary contacts. And then there were other sets of cards that used different colors to distinguish among revolutionary affiliations. So, red was for social for SRs, blue for social democrats, yellow for student organizations, white for professional associations, green for anarchists, and there were between 2 and 3 million of these cards by 1900. So this counter-revolutionary police in many ways becomes, a mirror image of the revolutionaries themselves. They adopted pseudonyms of their own, including distinctions between like elders and the young, which the revolutionaries of the 1880s were using. Mm-hmm. They enlisted their own family, like those of the revolutionaries, to host and keep watch over things like safe houses and arrange secret meetings and relay secret messages and things like that. And then they classified their agents according to the type of revolutionary each was dealing with, and the way that they divided them was terrorist agents, propagandist agents, and then typographist agents.
What's a typographist agent?
Well, let me quote James Billington. But seduction worked both ways. It proved difficult to involve oneself with the left without entering into its ideals and aspirations. Their development, therefore, in the late imperial period, a twilight world of uncertain allegiances and identities. However, much of the Okhrana and the revolutionaries opposed one another in principle. They shared in practice a common subculture of intrigue, anonymity, and excitement. They were the dynamic forces in a static society, and it was easier to change sides than to leave this alluring world altogether. So you get this in typographic agent. I thought it was a propagandist agent, but then there's two for each. I typed it in Google, typographics.
What do we get?
And I thought it was synonymous with propagandist agent, but that's what the book. I'm basically taking this from James Billington because he wrote the most out of this about this. But I assume it's something to do with someone who's promulgating propaganda,
like text propaganda.
Yeah,
I
like
see.
text, like going through
Writing pamphlets and shit.
Yeah.
All right, we'll go with that.
But they were a lot like, how the secret police of the secret police of like Northern Ireland or of I forget what they were called, but they used to do all these kind of crazy psyops with the IRA, and then like the FBI. Like if you look at any of these kind of right-wing militias, there'll be more federal agents than actual members, like real, like bona fide members. Like the people who try to kidnap the governor of Michigan, I think it was like 7 out of like 12 of them were federal agents or something, something crazy like that. Where
it's crazy.
It was the majority. I forget the exact number, but it was the majority of the people in that kidnapping plot were federal agents or federal informants. So it's, this is kind of where that stems from in the context of the 20th century is the Okhrana, and I wish there was more about them to read about, because it's a really fascinating organization or secret police force. You hear people say that they weren't hard enough, and that's exactly why the Russian Revolution happened. But I digress. Let's talk about the actual people that the Okhrana were hunting, because that's really the point of this episode.
Yep.
And at its inception, the Okhrana were they were sniffing out the remaining people's will. These nihilist populist movements. However, in the 1890s, with Russia's modernization process, they start to deal with professional Marxist groups. And just to pull this back for a moment to give you a bird's eye view, in the 1890s, Russia's going through a massive modernization process fueled by the state project of constructing railroads and connecting these regions that were far apart from each other. This was the era of Sergei Witt, of Minister of Finance. This is, between, 1880 or in 1903 or so. There was this massive economic expansion that was spearheaded by railroad and, heavy industrial industries. And then certain cities in Russia were really experiencing large degrees of economic growth. So Moscow, the central regions of European Russia, St. Petersburg, the Baltic cities, Russian Poland, some of the areas along the Dnieper River, and then southern Ural Mountains, ports such as Riga, which is modern day Latvia, and Odessa, they become very wealthy at this time. And then there was these oil boom towns as well, that were mainly in like Western Siberia, and then on the Caspian Sea region, Baku, which is in Azerbaijan, which is on the the west coast of the Caspian Sea. It's a very wealthy city. To this day, Baku is a very wealthy city, and it becomes this really wealthy city in this era in the late 1890s due to these oil booms. And then these cities that become wealthy, inevitably they become extremely westernized. So, like other countries, and we spoke about this, was it last episode or a couple episodes ago, the elite rich people, they spoke French. That was kind of like the language of the rich, was the French language.
Yep.
And this was common in places like Prussia and Poland as well. And they had like Renaissance style palaces and the Italian architecture and these cities were largely of more Western character. I'll quote from historian Abraham Asher. The state participated directly in the nation's economy to an extent unequaled in any Western country. In 1899, the state bought almost 2/3 of all Russian metallurgical production. By the early 20th century, it controlled some 70% of the railways and owned vast tracts of land, numerous mines and oil fields, and extensive forests. The national budgets from 1903 to 1913 indicated that the government received more than 25% of its income from various holdings. Russia's economic progress in the 11 years of Witt's tenure as Minister of Finance was by every standard remarkable. Railway trackages virtually doubled. Coal output in southern Russia jumped from 183 million poods in 1890 to 671 million in 1990. The state participated directly in the nation's economy to an extent unequaled in any Western country. In 1899, the state bought almost 2/3 of all Russia's metallurgical production. By the early 20th century, I'm rereading the same quote. Duh. Stupid. You don't have to edit it out. You can expose me for being dumb.
You got it.
I wrote down the same quote twice. Okay. Well, the point is, you don't need to hear this twice to understand the point I'm trying to make, is that there was a massive, nationalization that was spearheaded by, producing oil and railroad and all of that nice stuff that kind of makes a modern country. And parts of Russia were experiencing this wealth and other parts were not experiencing this wealth. And this was like one of the reasons why the German Empire was sort of freaked out by them at this period, because everyone was forecasting, like everyone in Europe throughout the world is forecasting that Russia would eventually surpass them in industrial and economic output. And it was one of the reasons why a lot of members of the German general staff wanted to go to war with them. They wanted to strangle the baby in the crib. So now on the flip side, the industrial boom gives birth to this large proletariat. Russia's industrial working class, it grew out of the peasantry. And I'm not an expert on the labor laws and how they compare to other industrialized economies at the time, but I do know that they were having many of the same problems as nations like Germany and Britain. Wages for unskilled workers were low. Factory conditions were often harsh. The urban flop houses and public soup kitchens were crowded and cramped. Unlike Germany, Russia did not have the same, accident insurance or old age pensions, leaving most workers unprotected if an accident happened. And, Germany's, the Germany of Otto von Bismarck was essentially, they created a welfare state. Everyone kind of associates right wing and left wing with kind of economics, but that's really not the case. Because calling Otto von Bismarck's Prussia is, left wing would be crazy. It just wouldn't make any sense. But I digress. At the same time, Russia had some advantages because, there's like this large Orthodox community. There's a large network of charities that provided, medical care for the injured. And, the Russians actually had more regulations when it came to things like child labor, especially when it came compared to the British, who had, like 10-year-old chimney sweeps. They also had a lot of holidays on the Orthodox calendar, which provided them with some, worker relief as well. Whether these factors made conditions better on the margins versus other industrial economies, I don't really know the answer to that. But in the 1890s, a new European Marxist party had emerged in Russia, most notably the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDRP, which was formed in March 1989 as an affiliated national section of the Second Workingmen's International Association, aka the Second International, an organization created to standardize the principles of Marxism after Marx's death in 1883. Owing to the explicitly revolutionary nature of the RSDRP program, the party was immediately placed under Okhrana surveillance. Unlike previous Marxist groups in Russia, this one was much better organized. The RSDRP was almost from its inception a party of exiles, and it was founded most notably by Vladimir Lenin, Julius Martov, and Sergei Plekhnakov. Now, Lenin's real name was Vladimir Ulyanov. He was born in 1870 in Simbirsk, which is a modest town on the Volga River in central Russia, to a middle-class family. Lenin was, a political code name for him. But he comes from a family that's kind of marked by the character of the intelligentsia. His father was a school inspector of humble origins who reached lower nobility. Kind of like when you see one of those kids in Antifa get arrested and you find out like their father is it's like a professor at Stanford or something. But he comes from a humble origin. And his father dies at an early age. And, allegedly it's something that Lenin had blamed on being worked to death. The second event
always got excuses, huh?
Yeah. The second event that really shapes him is the obviously what we touched on in the beginning of this episode was the execution of his beloved and admired older brother. So in 1895, he was arrested and exiled to Siberia. And he marries a teacher and a fellow revolutionary while he's there. I forget her name. It's something super Russian sounding, so I couldn't remember it. But he has this relationship, and she's like a fellow revolutionary. From what I've read, it's not really like, it's more of kind of like a political partnership rather than like a love relationship, but whatever.
I refuse to believe that. They smashed 100%.
No, yeah, of course they did that, but I'm saying, you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's juicier if we assume that.
And, Lenin used his Siberian exile productively. He produced his first major work, which is the development of capitalism in Russia. And right. You had, read that.
Yeah, I got some notes on that. So in that book, Lenin basically argues a few things. One, that Russia was on a unique path to capitalism, which was distinct from the experiences of Western European countries. He believed that capitalism in Russia was developing in a more kind of uneven and combined manner with elements of like feudalism and pre-capitalism structures that were kind of going alongside capitalist development. Lenin also thought that he was emphasizing the central role of the peasantry, the Russian peasantry, in the country's transition to capitalism. And he argues that the peasantry, which is a very large class of small-scale agricultural producers, was becoming increasingly integrated into the market economy, and that integration was driving capitalism to develop in the countryside. So Lenin was critical of the Russian bourgeoisie, who he thought was weak and lacking that, kind of revolutionary je ne sais quoi. And he thought that the bougie people were incapable of leading like a genuine democratic revolution, and that the working class, or what we would call the proletariat, had to step up and take the lead on that. And he argued that the imperialist expansion, the capitalist expansion, was just a natural consequence of capitalism, and that it had a really big impact on the global political and economic landscape, which frankly isn't wrong. But the most important point that he has is that Lenin believed that Russian working class in alliance with the peasantry had that potential to lead a real socialist revolution. And he argued that the working class should not limit its struggle to, these very narrow economic issues, but should also kind of take up the broader demands of the peasantry and fight for political power and establish a socialist state. So that's that's that book in a nutshell.
Well, another important part is that he's spending a good time critiquing like the previous populist thinkers, because that's kind of like the catch-all phrase that you can use for everyone at this period. Populist revolutionary thinkers. He's critiquing them, especially the romanticization of Russian peasantry. We in the 1870s, 1880s, there was this really weird moment where the radical intelligentsia class, so all the students from the universities and all that, they traveled to the countryside to try to like train the peasants on revolutionary change and socialism and all these things that they found in mainly like France and Germany. Mm-hmm. They try to educate them, and their goal was to mobilize the peasantry to basically overthrow the government. And what happened is that the peasants threw them out. They were like, right, "Get the hell out of here!"
You're talking about your weird ass left wing bullshit.
Yeah, and that's what Dostoevsky used to write about. Was like, who the hell? Like, basically, you have these like swindler university students, professors, this type of ilk, are going into these small towns and destroying them. They're poisoning people's minds.
Side note, I've got a really great pitch for a reality TV show. Take a bunch of these like super left wing like college students from like these places and send them off to places in the U.S. like rural areas and have them try to do the same thing and just like watch. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
That would make some good reality TV.
Well, what happens, you see a lot of like hardcore left-wing activists are not scared to go into like Idaho and start waving like a trans flag. You know what I mean? It's like more about
rural people are built different, and I think, and this is related to like getting off the reality TV pitch. The problem with these ideologists, these fucking Russian kids, right? They were going to the rural areas trying to teach them how to do socialism and revolution. The problem with them is that they didn't consider the culture, the needs, and the priorities of their target audience, and that's why they got thrown out, right? I mean, if it's something like that. I mean, at the top of the show, we were talking about how the rural areas, the peasantry, the working class folks, they all have different. They're different. The different set of priorities, and that still remains true even till today, pretty much everywhere around the world. And so I think the issue that they ran into was just trying to communicate something that did not translate well, to their everyday life.
Yeah, and a lot of these Russian peasants, most of them are illiterate. Most of them, if you show them some Marxist, it's kind of like that famous story of that guy who was in Afghanistan showing, like Afghani farmers in the middle of nowhere pictures of 9/11, and they were looking at it and they had zero clue or idea of what they were looking at.
Right, like they down to the buildings, they were like, "What is that?"
They had absolutely zero clue of what they were looking at. And then they find one of them and looks at it and he says, "What is that, Kabul?"
Yeah.
So not only does he not know about the event of 9/11, but he doesn't know what New York is, period.
Right.
He doesn't know he doesn't know what
the compute, you know?
Yeah, it just does not compute. And they don't, some of them didn't know what an Arab was.
Right.
And they had to communicate that a bunch of Arabs flew a plane into a village named New York.
A village.
A village named New York. So it was kind of like that, where maybe these people weren't that backwater, but they were backwater compared to the people teaching them, and
again,
it just didn't resonate.
The important point is not necessarily that they're backwater, because that's kind of pejorative. It's more like the values that they hold and the priorities that they have were just completely different, where they're just not on the same like spectrum. They're not vibing with the ideas that these folks from these cities and these universities are peddling, basically.
Yeah, but also they can't even read it.
Yeah,
like there's also just like how they can't even if they would be receptive to that kind of messaging, right. They can't read some pamphlet from France,
right,
about socialism or about workers or about some type of revolutionary systemic change. Like they just can't.
Right. They'd have to communicate it totally orally.
They can't have it communicated, and then they're just gonna be like, "What? Get out." Like imagine going to some untacted Amazon tribe and trying to,
explain socialism.
Explain socialism to them. Yeah. So yeah, it was a failure, and often these revolutionaries would be they would be handed to the police. So Lenin said, "Okay, that was dumb. We shouldn't do that. If we're going to work with some groups, we need to focus on the labor unions and things like that, like the worker, basically. Mm-hmm. That the working class had to play the leading role in the revolution." And because, people in the cities, they mainly, there was just a level of, a higher level of sophistication that you were kind of forced to know, even though the people in the cities and the working class, they did come from the peasantry themselves. So in 1990, Lenin...
1900.
1990. In 1990... Lenin is exiled to, or no, he's not exiled. His exile in Siberia ends, and then he lives in a couple different cities throughout Europe, Munich, London, and then eventually he ends up in Switzerland. And while in London, Lenin starts to work for Iskra, and Iskra is the newspaper for the SDLP. And the primary purpose of Iskra was to serve as a platform for Marxist revolutionary thought and ultimately unite various socialist factions under some type of common banner. Mm-hmm. And the newspaper would be smuggled into Russia. And from its inception, Iskra advocated the overthrow of the
Yeah, that.
It's late. It's late. It's late, and I have a newborn baby. Cut me some slack. From its inception,
we're leaving this
from the very beginning. From the very beginning, Iskra advocated regime change in Russia. They advocated for a change in government from the Tsar.
There you go.
There we go. Hopefully that resonates.
Nailed it.
Yeah, just keep it simple. Don't use fancy words. They wanted the Tsar's regime to end.
Want different government.
Or advocated it, specifically advocated it. So imagine if a newspaper from like some conservative outlet was like, we advocate the, revolutionary regime change of Joe Biden. don't take that out of context. I'm using that as a hypothetical.
Right. It's probably true somewhere.
Yeah, but someone's like, oh, we got another one. Throw him in jail for 22 years. But yeah, like, you know, those people would immediately be arrested. Like in America, they would be arrested for that. So, you know, it was a radical newspaper. Now, the most important work that Lenin did, or maybe his most well-known, was a pamphlet that he wrote. It was called "What Is to Be Done," and it was a tribute to one of the really leading populists of the previous era's novel of the same name, "What Is to Be Done." We spoke about that in our last episode, but you've read both of the "What Is to Be Done" and his other pamphlet. What were some of the main points of "What Is to Be Done"?
All right, more spark notes. Okay, so Lenin essentially argues in "What Is to Be Done" for the creation of a new type of party. And this was a vanguard party, basically a highly disciplined and centralized political party that was made up of professional revolutionaries who would, you know, effectively lead the working class in the struggle for socialism, whatever that means. Basically, he believed that the working class, again, you know, left to its own devices, would tend to engage in these economic struggles rather than you know, go out and make some revolutionary political action or change. So he emphasized the need for this type of a party to provide kind of that guidance, that political leadership for this group of people, for this working class. And this is really different from, you know, the elaborate and very bureaucratic and slow-moving structure of the SDLP. Instead, Lenin basically proposes a smaller, very dedicated, kind of secret society of professional revolutionaries. And this elite would, you know, pull the reins a little bit and steer the revolution and direct the working class. And according to Lenin, the working class on its own would develop, you know, only a trade union consciousness, right? So that would be the level that they would operate at, right? Just create a bunch of trade unions, and that, you know,
would fighting for benefits and stuff like that. You know,
right.
like
things that matter to them, right?
Yeah, things that let's fight for higher wages rather than let's fight for, you know, completely overthrowing the system. They wanted to work in the parameters of the system,
right? Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, they wanted to do revolutionary. They wanted to develop this kind of revolutionary consciousness,
right? But kind of working behind the scenes and guiding that larger class, which would be just working on the basic grunt work, you know, the trade union stuff, and to push this revolutionary cause, he believed that this party, this vanguard party, had to bring revolutionary political consciousness to the working class from the outside, right? And this was known as the, quote, revolutionary consciousness. It's pretty dense stuff, to be honest, right? A little hard to follow, but I think, you know, general ideas: set up a party, elite, small, fast-moving. Use that party to politically direct the working class. They'd all start up naturally, you know, focusing on the trade union things and the, you know, smaller economic issues that matter to them, and then eventually start introducing more revolutionary ideas and concepts from the outside.
Yeah, and as the Russian labor force grew in size, there sprang up an increasing number of these worker organizations and trade unions. Marxist groups would work with these groups to organize strikes and things like that. And it was called the concept of agitation.
Right. I mean, they basically created these Marxist cells to train revolutionaries.
Yeah. So in 1898, there was an attempt to weld these various cells, these regional organizations and committees, into a united revolutionary Marxist political party. And in that year, there took place the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDRP, forerunner of the later Communist Party of the Soviet Union. However, very little was actually achieved at the first Congress. There were only 9 delegates.
Yeah, not to mention that the party leadership was arrested soon after that and sent to jail. That party, quote unquote, it had no real organization. It just kind of like existed in name only.
Yeah, and a second attempt was made to forge a unified party in 1903, which in fact became the division of the RSDRP into its two major factions that we all know as the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And it was during this interval between the first and second Congress that really Lenin becomes this major player in the political party.
Right. Lenin was called like the revisionist, or he was against what he called revisionist theories of the German social democrat Edward Bernstein, who suggested that the transition to socialism could be done without a workers' revolution. So he was basically totally against that. He needed the workers, or at least that's what Lenin believed. And he attacked all the people who basically saw, who he saw as just being too soft on this particular issue, who weren't willing to go that whole mile. And they were, in a sense, collaborating with the current system. So he was like, it's all in or nothing for Lenin at this time.
And just think about the tremendous sacrifice you have to make to be a revolutionary. Most people don't want to do that. Like, most people are just, like we were saying earlier, most people just want to increase their wages or just ultimately increase their living standards. Mm-hmm. No one wants to disrupt the system so much that it becomes really hazy and foggy on the other side.
Right.
No one wants to do that.
I mean, not everybody wants to be Lenin's older brother and sacrifice their whole life, like literally sacrifice their life and martyr themselves to make revolutionary change. And when it comes down to it, most people just want to keep plugging along, even if it's just under the worst possible conditions. And
like, what happened? Like Rosa Luxemburg, like what happened to her? Like, her life was like incredibly tragic.
Yeah.
A lot of their lives are incredibly tragic because, I mean, just think about like the concentration you really have to neglect your personal lives and your family, and you have to commit it 100% to this cause. And it's almost like, becoming like a fundamentalist to a religion.
For sure.
It's
and the best ones are the ones that don't have any family or any connections, right? But yeah, and that's because it's easier for them to take up the mantle in that way. But it's a double-edged sword because, without those kind of family connections and that human element, it's hard for people to to identify with you. But as it goes for Lenin, he was so hard and hell-bent on his stand on party organization that it basically leads to like a schism in this brand new party at the Second Congress in 1903, which was held first in Brussels and then in London. And I want to talk a little bit about that schism because I think it's important. One of the most important items on this Congress's agenda turned out to be the question of the criteria for party membership, like who gets to be part of the club. Lenin's friend Julius Martov proposed that party members must obviously first accept the party program, right? Like you gotta be like cool with the agenda, and then second, support the party financially. Okay, now you got to put some skin in the game, get some money on the table, and then third, be prepared to work under the direction of one of the party's organizations. So, all right. You like what they're talking about, you're giving them some money, you're willing to put in some work. Those are the three, criteria to be a part of the party. And Lenin mostly agreed with the first two principles, but objected to the third. He thought that a party member has to work, in one of the party organizations it was like a slight variation of wording, which is weird. But what might seem to be merely just kind of like a semantic, argument, in fact, exposed two very different views as to what type of party there should be. So the first reading of it basically created the idea of a broad party of sympathetic supporters that were prepared to, just cooperate personally with party organizations. And the other one was a bit more narrow. This is the one that Lenin proposed, which, is more of a disciplined party of 100% fully committed activists. So to round this out, they were having a disagreement in the phrasing of the work. They both agreed that if you're part of the party, you should put in the work to push the party forward. Where Martov was trying to say is just you are willing to cooperate, and it's a little bit more loosey-goosey. And where Lenin's coming in is no, this has to be your life. You have to be fully committed to all of these party activities. And, Lenin was a bit of a hard ass, and he lost that vote. On the later item, though, which concerned the question of the party leadership and centralization, he got a little bit of a win by a slight majority, mostly because there was abstentions from his opponents, so they just didn't vote. And with this small lead, Lenin promptly dubbed his supporters the majorityites. The Russian word for majority is Bolshinstvo. Hence,
it's not important. The name Bolshevik.
Yeah, Bolshevik comes from that word. I'm not a Russian speaker. Sorry, it's tricky. It's all the consonants they put together. Anyway, so his opponents, led by Martov, despite actually becoming the larger section within the party, were called the minorities, or the Mensheviki. So that's where the Mensheviks come from, right? And that's where we get those two names and the divide there. So, important point, narrow majority, and I mean narrow because literally people forgot to vote or abstained from voting. That's the Lenin party, that's the Bolsheviks. And the Martovs were the minority, even though they technically had more people, and they were called the Mensheviks. So, for the moment, there were technically those two factions of the same party, and in spite of lots of attempts later to reunify all those parties, that split between the two parties, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, that ended up being just permanent. And with all this, I think it's a little premature to think of Bolshevism, or maybe more narrowly Marxist-Leninist theory, as a coherent and fully developed ideology, because they were still working it out themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's also a mistake to think that Lenin was even in complete control of the Bolsheviks faction. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, he had great, personal authority and, kind of this unshakable belief in the correctness of his own positions. However, he was not the bona fide, you can argue he wasn't the bona fide party leader yet in the full sense of the term. In any case, apart from a brief spell when he returned to Russia in 1905, he spent the years before 1917 mostly abroad. And therefore, he was really cut off from the everyday organizational activity of party workers on the ground in Russian towns and factories.
Right.
However, despite its kind of incoherent nature, Bolshevism, Bolshevism sounds like a television electronics company.
It's a shitty television that only shows you Marxist propaganda.
Yeah, that'd be a great name for a Soviet flat screen.
Look, this is a 42-inch flat screen Bolshevism.
Channel, Boris. It has Pravda and liquor commercial. Vodka.
So
In ballet too.
Let's just throw the most in hockey. That's Sports Channel. So another thing though is that this is definitely what you went over is definitely kind of like the most common narrative with when it comes to the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and it's strategy. But there's another theory, and I read this from Sean McMeekin, who's a historian on Russia, who wrote a lot of books on Russia and World War One. He wrote a lot. He wrote the book that he's well known for right now is Stalin's War, which is I think is a bestseller, where he kind of writes the case that Stalin was going to invade Germany. But he wrote another book on the Russian Revolution, and it's kind of like more of the it kind of cuts through a lot of he tries to cut through a lot of common narratives, and he's by no means like an extreme. He's a professor at like University of Idaho, I think. He wrote in his book, and I'll just read his quote, but I read some other things from other historians from the region on the Russian Revolution, but I'll quote: "The foregrounding of the Jewish question undeniably marked the history of the Russian Russian socialism. Contrary to the common belief expounded in most history books that the famous Bolshevik-Menshevik split of July 1903 occurred because of Lenin's advocacy of a professional cadre of elites outlined in his 1902 pamphlets What Is to Be Done, was oppressed by Mensheviks who wanted mass worker participation in the party. The real fireworks at the Brussels Congress surrounded the Jewish question. Party organization was not even discussed until the 14th plenary session. Lenin's main goal in Brussels was to defeat the Bund, that is, Jewish autonomy inside the party. His winning argument was that Jews were not really a nation, as they shared neither a common language nor a common national territory. Martov, the founder of the Bund, took great umbrage at this and walked out in protest to form the new Menshevik minority faction. He was followed by nearly all Jewish socialists, including notably Lev Bronstein, who's Trotsky, a young intellectual from Kherson in southern Ukraine who had studied at a German school in cosmopolitan Odessa, which helped prime him for the appeal of European Marxism. With Lenin all but marrowing the arguments of Russian anti-Semites, it is hard to see why Martov, Trotsky, and other Jews joined the opposition. Paradoxically, the merging of the Bund with the new Menshevik faction of the RSDRP, through confirming for the Okhrana agents the tautology that Russian Jews were socialist, may actually have weakened the Jewish character of Russian Marxism, now that Lenin's Gentile-led Bolshevik majority faction stood in pole position, even if it was confusingly much smaller in number than the Menshevik faction and the Bund. In fact, Lenin had rejected Jewish socialist internationalism, the cosmopolitan faith of such intellectuals as Trotsky, for Russia's native revolutionary tradition grafted its own ruthless version of populism onto Marxism. Bolshevism, like its founder, was Russian to the core. So
that kind of there's that, I don't want to say racism, but like racial element to this that's kind of overlooked a little bit.
So yeah, and I read this. So the book, he quotes in the book another historian named Harold Schuckman, who wrote books about the Russian Revolution, and he wrote this paper about the Bund, and he actually goes through a lot of firsthand sources, and he really makes the case that this was kind of like a tribal kind of ethnic breakup between Jews and non-Jews. So, I mean, that's just something to consider, really. I'm not, again, an expert on any of these topics, but it's something that you're kind of forced to talk about because, there were a large percentage of the communists, or I guess a disproportionate amount of the socialists in Russia were Jews. So, I say we wrap this episode up because the next thing to talk about, we can take this in two different directions. One of the where I wanted to kind of end this though was that, or possible places that we could lead off. These groups had zero power at the time in Russia. They're exiles, so they have zero power. They don't really start to gain traction until there's these massive shocks to the system. And those shocks happen in 1905. Most notable, the big one is really the Russo-Japanese War, when Russia has this humiliating defeat. It causes all sorts of social unrest in the country.
Right.
And that's when they're able to start capitalizing on that social unrest. But another thing I think we need to talk about is, more, there's another character, and I think it's definitely a controversial topic, but I think we should touch on it too, is more so the Jewish Bund, which is a major faction in the Russian Revolution as well. So let's put a pin on it.
Yeah, we can go over that. We can think about them.
Let's put a pin on it, and let's reconvene.
Sounds good.
It is also super hot in here, so I can't.
Also, this is like the sixth time we've tried this, so I'm just happy we've gotten this far.
Yeah, and it's summer. These summer episodes are usually deadly because
they're brutal.
It is at night. You got to turn the AC off because it gets hot, or because they're loud and it interferes with the microphone. So let's end this. Thanks for listening to another episode of Bro History. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support our show. And then you can also join us on Patreon if you want to support us there. Danny, anything else?
Nope. Actually,
right.
One thing, we've been pumping out a lot of stuff on YouTube, and I'm really enjoying reading and responding to some of the comments that are left on the on those videos. So, one thing that I've always lamented about getting ratings and reviews on our iTunes and Spotify is that we can't say shit back. So we can't engage with you. So that's a really great way if you want to just chat. A lot of the times some of you guys are bringing up some theories that we didn't cover and, showing us some cool stuff. So if you want to engage with us directly, that's a really great way to do it too.
All right. Peace, guys.
Peace.